All right, so we've got the stream link up now. If this works, then we're going to go for it. So if people who are streaming could let me know if they can hear me okay. Anyone? I have my lap that are pretty unexpected, so I might have to switch. Sound's gone, sound's back, sound's gone. You hear anything? No more. Can't see anything. Interesting. Okay. Good on the stream now? We should be back up. Theoretically, will be up. Hopefully the streamers agree that that is actually the case. Cool. It's back. Great. All right. So I'm going to go ahead and try to press on. Like I said, bear with me, please. I'm sorry it's already been such a mess, but technology has a way. Okay. All right. So now we're actually going to attempt to go over something a little bit. So hopefully you guys got a little bit of time to work on the array stuff. We're going to go ahead and talk about it a bit. If I can pull up my VS Code. I remember why I don't particularly like this teaching in this class. The sun is right behind me as I'm trying to show you guys stuff, which is a ton of fun, as you can imagine. All right, so streamers, I assume you're still good. Looks like I still have internet connection. Again, I'm sorry for the technical delays. Wasn't expecting this. For the streamers, filling in for Robbie for the next few classes. I won't be here Tuesday, but a few after that. We're going to go over a little bit of the stuff that we didn't cover in the last lesson, a little bit about array, prototype methods, some of the new ones in ES6, and some Babel stuff before we get into React, and then we'll go ahead and jump into React. So if anyone has questions, of course, you know the drill. Hit up the TAs on Slack, or if you're here in person, go ahead and ask me. Did anyone get a chance to finish this array example? How's everyone feeling? I like to do a little fist of 5 method, right? So out of 5, hold up your hand. How are you feeling on the arrays? Anyone? No one has any feeling on the arrays? 3s, some 3s, some 4s. Was that a 0 back there or a 5? Was it a 0? Okay, well, we're going to try to go over it and see if we can't get you up a couple of points there. So these new array methods are kind of confusing, okay? They're bringing in some functional programming aspects into JavaScript more than you've seen before. So we're used to doing for loops and for in loops maybe, and while loops and all kinds of other stuff. But now we're using functions that actually use other functions to do these looping mechanisms, okay? And there's a traditional sort of function that you'll see used in more sophisticated programs as you go further along in your career called map. And what map is a function specifically to transform an array into another array. As a matter of fact, it maps a function over the elements of your array. So you can see we have a little example. Create an array of just names from the princess's array. Map creates a new array with the results of calling a provided function on every element in the calling array, okay? So what are we going to do? We have these lists of princesses. All right, what we want to do in this particular case, the names. And we know that the princesses are objects, right? Now, we're all familiar with a little bit of object structuring and a little bit of that. We know that objects have properties. Well, conveniently, every princess is going to have a name property. And because we want to get just that name, we can give our map function specifically the instructions to return just the name of each princess. So if we look at this call signature here, we have princesses.map, and princesses is an array. Okay? and you can see up here, they all have a name: Rapunzel, Mulan, Anna, Moana, and I skipped for each. We'll get back to that. And it simply is the array dot map, and then the function of how we want to map over that array, okay? Is everyone kind of seeing the structure? Now, what do you think this names is going to print? Anyone have an idea of what this names is going to print when you console log it? It's going to print Rapunzel, Mulan, Anna, Moana. Right? Everyone kind of see how that is? Let's see if I can show it real quick. So, I'm going to little in app terminal. We go ahead and run it. What was that? Of course it did. Do you guys want to, is that when we're restarting? Comes back up. Might have you move to another table here that has a working pod. Okay, so we ran code real quick, and you can see right here, we're console logging names. We get out literally the transformation of those names. Does that make sense? Is anyone a little confused about how that works? I know it's kind of weird. We're giving a function to a function, and that function is like knowing how to go over all the elements of array. It's really kind of an thing set up there. The question was, if we console log this princess, what will we get effectively? And you said, will we get the same stuff, the princess, right? Yes, you will. It is exactly what it is. And that's a great question to ask. The princess, right? And I go ahead and I run this again. You'll see print all the princesses right here. My names. That's exactly just like a for loop where you have the indexes, you know, and you take the index, and it's like index I equals 0, whatever, and get index 0 of the array, and then you could print that out. This is a less verbose way of doing it with the map. Now remember, map is a very specific function, and that function is to transform an array from one to another, right? To do something to the elements of that array to get a new array out. Same number of elements, okay? So if I have 4 princesses, I'm going to get 4 somethings out. In this case, we're going to get 4 names. If I had, 5 numbers and I wanted to add 1 to all of them, I'd get 5 more numbers with 1 added to them. So it's specifically a transformation function, and there's a lot of utility in it. Now, right above that, you'll see kind of a less fun version, and that is the dot for each. So this one is very similar to the map. The difference is it doesn't return anything. Okay, so this is a literal for each over the array. This is just like if you did a for loop. Nothing is technically returned from a for loop, right? It's just a construct that we use in JavaScript to do something. The technical term is to iterate over the array, okay? And that's what this for each is. It's basically just a nice way you can plug in any old function to effectively help you iterate over that array. Get every element out, do something to it. Who knows what you want to do with it, whatever. So for each is another way that you can effectively do your for loops. Again, you're not going to get anything back, whereas in the map, you go ahead and get these names. Filter, moving on. The filter right here is slightly different, again, but has the same utility, which is we have a function we're passing in, and we're getting another array out, similar to the map. It's going to iterate over everything in the array, like the for each or the map would, except for filter. Can anyone guess what the filter is going to do? Yeah, that's a good guess. And that's what it does. What the filter expects from you is you're going to take in the parameters you're iterating over, and you have to return a Boolean value. Everyone remember what a Boolean is? What are the 2 values of Boolean? True and false. So you either got to give it a true or a false. If that element that you're at, when you call this function, returns a true, that means it is going to be returned in the final output array. If you return false, it will not be. For instance, if a name starts with M, it's going to return true, and those arrays are going to be part of the final output. And you can actually see down here in the terminal where it runs it, M names, Mulan, Moana, the other 2 are gone. Anna and Rapunzel are just magically gone because we're filtering them out with the Boolean return value from that function. Now, last but not least, we're on the reduce. And the reduce is probably, well, not probably, it is the most confusing of the four functions we're looking at right now, but it's probably the most powerful in a lot of ways. Now, what the reduce does is, well, it reduces things. And I know that's not really a great explanation, so we're going to talk about it a little bit. What reduce is actually used for is taking an array and aggregating it in some way, okay? So, for instance, we want to get the average age of all of the princesses. And to do that, you got to start with the total sum of all of the ages, right? And what a reduce allows us to do is basically say we have one final value we want, and we're going to somehow accumulate that final value out of the array. And by accumulate, if you're not familiar with the term, we're just going to be basically using the elements of that array to do something, to aggregate some result or whatever. And in this case, our accumulator is a sum. So the first parameter is always your accumulator. A lot of times you'll see it abbreviated ACC. Isn't the best abbreviation, but that's what it is. It's an accumulator. In this case, sum makes a lot of sense because we're going to get the sum of the princesses' ages. The second parameter that comes in the function is the current element of the array. So this will be called 4 times. Actually, yeah, because there's 4 princesses. And this would be Anna, Rapunzel, Moana, Mulan. Okay? And then what we do every time is we're adding the sum, the current accumulator, and the current princess's age, and returning that value. So the return value of the reduce is the next value of your accumulator. So this is where it starts to get kind of complicated. So you'll notice, too, that it's a slightly different. The reduce function doesn't just take a function in. It also takes something else after the function. In this case, it takes a 0. Does anyone want to guess why it takes a 0? And what that 0 could possibly be? The starting accumulator. It is the starting accumulator. So who wants to tell me this reduce function starts getting run the first time we run it? Say Rapunzel is the first princess, and say she's 10. Okay? I don't know actually how old she is. We could scroll up, but I don't want to do that. What is sum going to be? And what is princess going to be? And then what is the output going to be? Someone tell me. Sum is going to be the starting accumulator, right? Which is 0. Princess is going to be the first princess, which is Rapunzel, who has an age of 10. And when I add 0 and 10, I obviously get 10. So the next iteration of this function is going to have the current accumulator. What is the current accumulator? So say next one is Mulan, and Mulan's 20. We take in 10 as the sum in Mulan. We add 10 plus Mulan's age, which is now 30, right? And that is the return value of this function. We go to the next princess. What is our next accumulator? 30. You guys kind of starting to see how this adds up? It's like a weird chain of stuff you can do to get a new value out of an array. So you could think of this as a perfect example. Doing math over an array, fantastic use of reduce. Say you wanted to build an object out of an array, fantastic use of a reduce. Anytime where you want to take an array and turn it into one value, reducing it to one value. Doesn't one value. Know that a reduce is literally used to reduce an array to something. And in this case, a number. How are we feeling on that? We covered these real quick. 5 to 5. How's everyone feeling? No, it's confusing. We got some 4s, we got some more 5s, got some 2s and 3s. Okay. It's going to take a while for this stuff to sink in, and I'd love to talk more about it. We're already behind on time because I took 30 minutes to even figure out what I was doing. So we're going to kind of jump ahead. The next thing I want to talk about, we're going to skip a couple of lessons here, is Babel. So there's a lot of stuff in the ES6 syntax. One of them, did they talk about imports and exports? So one of them is importing and exporting, okay? So really quickly, I'm going to pull that up. And let's see, 111. Let me just pull it up real quick because I want to show you this. Before I talk about Babel. ES6 is interesting because it adds a whole bunch of new syntax. Does everyone remember require from Node? We all remember require. We're feeling it. We know it's used to get a package and kind of use that package and return some stuff. I mean, it could be anything. It could be some functions. Could be an object. Who knows? Magic. It's generally an object, but depends on how they do it. Well, ES6 adds something that's a slightly more intuitive. Slightly. I say slightly because it depends on how you view it, and it'll take a little bit to totally understand what's going on. However, it is more common, especially in more sophisticated code bases, and that is export. So where we used require in our default node, we now have this new import export that's, I would say the reasoning behind it is it's more traditional in terms of your other standard programming languages like Java and C#. And there were some problems with require that people said, these are really stupid, and I don't really want to deal with these anymore, like being able to override require to do whatever you wanted, really, and other fun stuff, and circular dependencies. And it's crazy. There's a whole list of crap that's wrong with require. Don't worry about it too much right now. Just know that people don't really like it. So they came up with this import-export syntax. We see import right here that people now use specifically on the web, but they're starting to get there in Node as well. And it's not baked into the language. So you can see already it looks kind of similar to require, right? So with require, we would basically have this statement right here with require in front of it, right? I don't know if you've gone over const, but you could use const here. But anyway, this is your require statement, right? Looks pretty similar to the import statement right below it. Import's a little bit more intuitive, in my opinion. You're something, a module, from some file. Whereas before you value back because you required the file, right? So they're very similar in that regard. Now on last class, that's what this is right here. So with the require statements, with the import statements, with any old object, you can take advantage of object destructuring, which if you don't remember, is basically where you can split up an object at the time that you want it into its individual properties. So if we look at this utils, you can see we have remove, unique, array to obj, random. If we look at this utils, and we have an index.js, and in there you have these functions that are all exported. Now again, this is going to look very different because where we used module.exports or just exports or however you wanted to do it from Node, we now have an export keyword that exports stuff. So this is really interesting because you'll notice where in Node, we're usually used to doing module.exports equals some sort of object, and then maybe you would do remove, and maybe you do unique, right? And so you can imagine if I were to require this index.js into my next file, I could just take remove and unique out, and I could actually destructure them out of the required statement too, just like we saw with the other import statement in the index.js. So same thing applies. I could just pull them out like this. But instead, they've decided to use a more intuitive syntax, which is just export the individual members yourself. And Babel, when you run Babel over this, knows what to do with it, and it builds that module exports that we're so familiar with. So you don't handle it. Talking a lot right now. I'm trying to go through this fast because we got to move on. And it's a shame because there's a lot going on here. So I don't expect you all to be super comfortable with what I'm talking about right now. We'll deal with that as we get to it. Just know that there's import and export, and they're really fancy. People like them a lot, and we're going to use them pretty much from now on, especially with React. There's other cool things that Babel allows as well, and that is, special async syntax and all kinds of get by default in Node.js. So that was a lot. I'm going to go ahead and ask Fist 5. I don't expect very good results on this one because I went fast, and I get this is very confusing. But does anyone think they've got a good understanding of what's going on here? Yes. Okay. Yes. So the question was, this is new syntax for ES6 that Babel takes and just transforms it to Node. And the answer is absolutely yes. That require statement you see with the before remove, that before unique, before obj, those are going to be transformed into those similar require statements when we run this through the Babel transpiler. Now, Babel, I don't know if I gave you a sufficient explanation. I can't quite remember. But basically, Babel is a neat tool that takes this cool syntax and turns it into what we're familiar with, right? And it does it in all kinds of special ways, and it's fantastic. and it does something called transpilation. You might have heard the word compilation, which is basically where you take code and you turn it into machine language or whatever. Transpilation is basically taking code, turning it into more code. That's it. It just got a fancy name. So anyway, we're going to touch on Babel a bit because there's a lot going on here, like I said, and we got to learn a little bit about how Babel works. So I was supposed to talk about transpilation. Now, sorry, I would be more prepared, but again, I got thrown off a little bit by the tech stuff. I'm kind of reading through this right now until we get to the React. So we use Babel basically to use all the new fun tools. And every time that there's a new JavaScript spec that comes out, and that's the specification that defines how the language changes, Babel updates to add new packages that allow you to do this stuff before it actually technically exists, which is kind of cool. Like I said, import and export. That import from, if you tried to use that in just a Node package, even on the latest version of Node, Node 10.2 point whatever, you'd get errors. It would say invalid syntax, something, something, and I can actually run that. Find my cursor. I can actually run that in here without running Babel, just trying to run this Node index.js, and I got a crazy message right there. And this is basically what Babel prevents. So see, it says import. It's like, hey, I don't know what that is. And it's because it doesn't. It doesn't at all. But with this fancy Babel, which has this cool little Babel RC, and I can go ahead and do npmi and install everything. Let's go ahead and I'll just here, get rid of my changes there. We'll just go ahead and run Babel. The Babel core is not installed. If it ever finishes. There's some other tools you can add. Babel core and Babel CLI. Basically, these tools Babel over this code and turn it into working code. So what I want everyone to do while I'm installing this and before we run this is -G Babel CLI on your machine, right? Because we're going to go ahead and jump into Babel. Why we're going to for the React is because React uses Babel, of course. So without it, you can't use React. Just simple as that. So npm install -G Babel -CLI machine to get stuff. Yeah, you just need the CLI. All right, so Babel with -F index.js. See if it babbles it for us. Might not. Whoa. He's having a hard time. All right, we're gonna move on. So we've got everyone got that installed globally. Okay, well, we've got some instructions for you. We're gonna go ahead and we're gonna do some Babel stuff together. We're gonna have you go ahead and do it. We're gonna have the TA Slack out the instructions for this one, which is 112. We're just gonna spend a couple of minutes running Babel and getting your Babel code to build. And once you get it to build, I want you to look at the output and see what you see. Compare it to the Babel code, the ES6 code that has like import, export, and all that fun stuff, and tell me what you see. we're going to go ahead and halt it, and we're just going to go over it together. Now, again, I went through Babel really quick, so this one was probably really tough, and you probably had to do some. Did anyone finish it? By chance? Got to the index file, you got close? Nice, that's awesome. That's fantastic. Okay, so let's go over a little bit together. To explain at all, which is my bad, was the default exports. Okay, so there was a file that said, hey, you need a default export, and we'll get to that really quick. So this file, they want you to export individually each array. How do we do that? Does anyone know? Yeah? Yeah? What is it?
Export default and then brackets or
okay, so you did export default stick figure and happy face, right?
Yeah, but I did brackets. Oh, I guess.
Oh, you did them. You did them as an array. Okay, that is definitely one way you could do it, and that's really awesome that you figured that out. That's great. So the default export right here that he was using basically says, let's export all of these things. Well, he's putting them in array brackets, so he's exporting them as 3 different arrays, which you can definitely do. And he's doing, now the default export's special. There can only be one file, and file itself, and that what you get out of it is that default export. So if you have individual named exports and you were to just import that, you would basically have this weird object that doesn't do anything but holds your exports. If you were to import directly a default export, it is exactly what you exported. So we're going to change it up just a little bit. The array works great, but because you have to access that as an array, it makes it a little bit more difficult to use for this example. So default export's good. Another way you could do it, exporting this by prefixing import keyword const. And so these are named exports. So to get them out of to import explicitly name here, right? Star, stick figure, happy face. Now both of these are effectively the same. It's default, but we're going to go ahead and do individual named exports here on this file. So this is how you'd export them. Simple. Put export in front of the const and boom, exported. So let's go ahead and look at the sprite logger. Now the sprite logger wants that default export. And again, you do export, then the keyword default, and you do sprite logger. Now that's a default export. It's not a named export. So I'll show you in just a moment what the difference is when you're importing. So we go ahead and go to the index here. Now we need to import all that stuff. So let's go ahead and import logger from logger. Okay, so you'll notice something. My import is just called sprite logger, which is the same as the name of the file, okay? It doesn't have to be. Now, if we want to do the individual named exports from the other file, that one is sprites, right? So in here we have star, happy face, and I forget the other one was. Stick figure. Okay? Excuse me. So these are the individual named exports now imported into a file. And you'll notice they have the same name here as they do when they're exported, right? So happy face is happy face, star is star, stick figure, stick figure. However, I said the sprite logger doesn't necessarily have to have the same name. That's because it's the. So I could call this test. And did not like whatever I just did. I'll call it testy. And as long as I rename these right here, testy, I have what I need. So if we go ahead and run Babel node on index.js. Oh, oops. Gotta go in one more directory. So if we do Babel node on index.js, we get an error. Can't not find. Oh, Yep, I didn't do npm install. Good catch. Never forget to do npm install, especially when you're giving a demonstration. It makes the most sense to do it then. All right, so we install everything. We go ahead and now run our Babel node. We get our happy face and our stick figure and our star. Sprite logger function that I call pesty still works because it's a default export. It doesn't really matter what the name is. Called sprite logger here. That's great. It's fantastic. But when I import it into the index.js, I want to call it because it's technically called default. So it's whatever. So I know we did a little example of Babel. There's a couple of things to remember. npm install, always do that. 2, Babel, didn't really discuss much, has this Babel RC, which sets presets, which if you look at our package JSON, we have those installed. Babel preset env and stage 2. Babel RC presets, preset env, preset stage 2, is an array with env and stage 2. You see how that matches up? The .babel RC basically tells Babel what it's going to use to figure stuff out. And env basically says we want the 2015 environment stage of rules to say these are the features we allow. So you need the Babel RC, you need the presets, and we have Babel CLI globally. We use Babel node, which comes with Babel CLI, to basically say run this node script with Babel CLI. Okay? It's not always going to work that way. We're about to jump into React. We'll see how it can be a little bit different, but that's the gist of Babel at the very at its, and it may not be parts, but how does everyone feel? Just a 5 on this one? Feeling okay? Getting a little closer? Import export. How are we feeling about that now? Just 5? Yeah, we're getting a little bit better. I know it's tough. There's a lot to sink in. We're going really, really fast. I made a couple mistakes, and that's my bad. But if you have questions, ask them now. How many testes can we have? Well, in this case, it's a really good question. Some people have 3, some people have 2, some people don't have any. It just depends. All right. So we're going to go ahead. If no one has any questions on the Babel stuff, a little bit, and we're going to go ahead and try to do what the lesson today was supposed to be. We're not going to finish. So unfortunately, whoever is picking up for me on the next Tuesday is going to have a little bit of work to do like I did. But we're going to start talking. So again, last moment to have questions. And actually, I think what we're going to, I'll just have you guys take a break real quick. We're going to have an earlier break. We're actually going to kind of change up how this stuff works. Give you a moment to kind of think about what we just did before we move to React. It is a big jump from what we were just talking about to go to React. And so it doesn't particularly matter how we break this up. So again, any questions on Babel or import or export? Everyone's feeling okay? Great. Let's take like a 10-minute break. 7:35, let's be back, and we'll go ahead and start on React.
Key vocabulary word for when you guys are in an interview, transpile. You want to take a look at that. Transpile. That's the vocabulary. Use that.
Does anyone remember what that means? Anyone can tell me? Yep, that's one another. Takes code of one syntax and turns it into code of another syntax through some wizardry. It just happens.
Even a light job. More of a try.
So whatever drivers are on the new 18.4 do not like this, and they just were dumping, because now I'm fine. I switched to an older driver set, and everything seems to be okay. So I have no idea what the hell happened. I'm not running this problem yet, but now I know. So hopefully I never run into it again. Yeah.
So
Sure.
I did, I did what you did.
The first season is a little bit scary, but
So for me,
after that, it's nice. But if all seasons are
okay. There's no like right way, however you get it to work, right? So that's not there. Now, one thing you're missing there, you have the export default, right? And the default export doesn't even
I look exactly the same.
but the individual, I don't know, like, so when you have import stars that you write file, what do you actually get?
Well,
And people.
Oh, really? Yeah. Yeah. Duh, of course. You know what I mean? Because, like, why can't yeah. I was in that. Yeah.
Go ahead and talk about it. Might be because you want to go back to what
It's so funny. When you're pretending to be all different people, and it's like fun. I love that guy.
because you're using the default export with the main properties in it, why don't you go ahead and try, you need to import and then like, import and then name it by. Go ahead and give her the individual, individual ranks and all. Importing from the price file. But. And go ahead and do a console on the range. It does not like how you're doing the automatic. You have to talk about that and see what next
Oh, it's great.
Of course.
So, yeah, that's true.
I know. I'm gonna put, their headquarters here. Like, headquarters over here. See what
I'm actually curious as to what that other one is gonna output.
So they're giving away all these red light cameras. And they're charging, and then all the body cameras. And they're charging the host all of
It refreshes the phone. I was like 7:34. I kind of do. It was like nope. The sun was like right.
What's behind you? You're wearing a shirt. Check this out. The only thing you can drive. Like wide awake and trying to drive.
Yeah, so this is what you were trying to do with the default export, right?
Yeah, that's what I do.
So you can see here, if I do this, if I do .star, it should log out the star. See? So I don't know, maybe we had a typo somewhere. But if you look here, this is what you were attempting to do. And this is how you'd get it out.
I'll just stick to the
Yeah, if you're doing the individual ones, it's better to do the individual exports anyway. It's more common, but you can do either. I mean, you can get pretty creative, as you can see.
And it's like, there's everyone's gonna be like,
For whatever reason, it's not so. It's not so.
Yeah.
They're all up to the border patrol checkpoint with arm out.
All right, we're going to go ahead and try to get started here pretty quick. Try to get going again. So people who are online streaming, try to get back to your machines if you can hear me. I guess if you're not at your machine, then you won't hear me. All right, is this pretty much everyone? I guess I have a small class, huh? Yeah, it's toward the end of the cohort. Ours, we had some people leave and stuff like that. We had more people, kind of, always going remote. It happens. There's some, I'm not saying any people remote today are like that. Never met you, so I assume you're great students who work very hard at what you do. I mean, you're still in it, so this is like, in my opinion, you can ask Nikki. I was actually the TA for her cohort, did some instructing, and I actually taught her the entire React section because their instructor was out. I think this is, yeah, that's what she does for a job. Because I taught extra React lessons that were so amazing, how couldn't anyone hire you? That's why, no, just kidding. Anyway, React, I think, is the fun part. Or one of the more fun parts of the entire thing. Now, the problem with it is it's really hard. I'm not going to shy away from that. This is probably going to be the hardest thing you do also in this entire class, but it's the most rewarding. I mean, we went to a React meetup 2 weeks ago or something. There was almost 100 people there, and about 15 of them I had taught in one of these cohorts at one point or another. So already that should be a great sign that just by going through this boot camp, your network is going to be quite expansive. And that is the first step to being very successful in any career, especially our career, because as you go along, getting a job is tough in the beginning, and you'll find that it's who you know, and you'll find someone and they'll be like, hey, you're really good. You just want a job? And you're like, hey, yeah, sweet. And then more money. So great. It works out. So I definitely recommend as you get better with React, better with the stack, more comfortable. If this is really your passion, go to meetups, learn a lot about React and how it's evolving, how it's changing the landscape of web development, how it already has changed that landscape, and just continue to learn, as you go. So anyway, it's worthwhile is what I'm trying to say. It's hard, but it's very worthwhile. If you have questions at any point while we're going over this, feel free to ask. This is really an introductory class on React. There's no way we can be comprehensive. It's way too vast of a topic. Now, despite everything I just said too, don't let it scare you that much because we're going to go baby steps. We're going to figure it out. So this is React Gently, some little slides that they give us to go over. Whether they help or not, I don't know. We'll find out. Welcome to React.js. Woo! Do not treat this class as a spoon feeding session. Okay, I guess that's for me. This is immersion and exposure, and that's true. React can be tough. You're going to practice a lot, but it's worth it. Everything I just said, yeah, they're saying it too. So what exactly is React, okay? So first of all, who is familiar with the term open source? We should all be pretty familiar with it to some extent at this point. Anyone want to give us a definition of what that means? Yeah?
It's not really owned necessarily by anyone. I think that there's a type of license on it where anybody can use it without having to pay a fee, whether it's like personal or commercial purpose.
Okay.
And it's maintained by community in many cases.
Okay, so the answer I got was it's not really owned by anyone. There's special licensing that allows you to use it kind of freely. Yeah, you have some more to add? Yes, the add-on we got to the first answer was the code is freely available for everyone to see and use. That is also, both of them are great answers. There's special licensing around open source pretty much always to protect corporations from abusing it, or I should say abusing the sole source from anyone. I mean, obviously they could take the repo and make their own version of it and abuse it if they wanted, but no one would use it, right? And then the code is available for anyone to look at, anyone to use, anyone to copy. Sometimes some licenses have some restrictions. For instance, Git, we're all familiar with Git now. Git has a special license called GPL, which basically means you cannot use it in a for-profit product. Anything you use with a GPL license also has to be open source. So you can use stuff that uses it, but you can't actually use it as the product. So that is kind of a distinction. But you can't, bundle Git and have Git built into your product, but you could have something that opens Git and maybe does a command on it because you technically have Git installed separately. But there's special licensing around open source to kind of protect people from it. And GPL, for instance, basically means no one can just steal it and abuse Git. So what else besides it being open source and written in JavaScript? It was developed for the purpose of building large apps with rapidly changing data, and that's true. React was it wasn't the pioneer, but it was definitely changed the game in what we call single-page applications. Now, the traditional web, as we know it, you'll probably notice this from websites like GitHub and Amazon and stuff like that, where you'll search for something, you'll hit a button, the screen kind of goes white, flickers real quick, and then it loads up some new stuff. So that is not a single-page application. What's happening is when you hit that button or you type an address in your address bar, right, a URL, and you go to that website, your browser is making a request to a server somewhere, and it's sending back some HTML. When you hit the search button on Amazon, it's going back to the Amazon servers, and it's sending back some HTML. React is different. Single-page applications are different in that you get HTML one time. The first time you go to the website, you get the HTML. From that point forward, React knows how to react to the data it gets back. So through JSON, through, it could get HTML, whatever you need really, it reacts to those changes. So it seems immediate. It seems more like a native desktop application as opposed to a website. And that's really what React has changed the game in that space. It wasn't a pioneer per se, because there's plenty of other things that did it first, but it was, it's kind of taken over. And the last thing about it that's kind of important, it relies on a component-based architecture. So one of the cool things about React that changed the game was everything is built into these tiny little components, which you'll see very shortly. They're basically like pieces of HTML, JavaScript, and CSS all in one file that you can use interchangeably anywhere. And that's what's beautiful about it. There were a lot of assumptions about how you should architect your apps, especially big, complicated apps, for a long time. They were kind of thrown out the window when React came in, and everyone said, well, this is actually way better. And that's why React has dominated. And there's other people, there's other libraries like Vue that are similar to React, kind of share that same spirit, but they're meant to be a little easier or whatever, you know. But React has kind of changed the game and how the UI works because of this component-based architecture. So it's very important you understand that, and there's no getting around it. You're going to understand it. So Facebook uses React, crazy enough. And you'll notice it's a very complex UI, but it's very responsive. Things kind of work really fast. Now, the whole Facebook isn't written in React, but a lot of the important parts are, like the Messenger and stuff. And you'll notice things don't like reload. They just kind of like appear and stuff changes. And that's a telltale sign that you want to have a single page application. And because Facebook wrote React, it's probably React. So the concept of components. You can see this little diagram may or may not be helpful. But the idea is when you have an HTML page, we all know by now that we have HTML elements. And you can think of those as building blocks for your page, right? They're, you know, you have a div, you'll have stuff in the div, you might have some p tags, you might have some span, you might have a form with some inputs. That's all great. And those are components, effectively, at their very smallest level. They're just individual HTML elements. They're the elements that make up your components. Now, how can we view that in a more composable sort of way? And the answer is you can build the React style components that allow you to take full, full pictures of your UI and split them into smaller little bits. So for instance, your search bar might be a component, right? Maybe you need the search bar on 5 different pages. You want it to look a certain way. You want it to feel a certain way. You want it to do certain things, but you don't want to type the HTML for it every single time. You wish you just had some nice way to say, I want the search bar here, and it's just going to do magic search bar stuff. In React, you can do that. Or say you have the home page, the entire page, you want it to be a special component in and of itself that reacts to data a special way and changes how its children look. The inner components look based off of something you get. Maybe your name is John. And you go to the page, and if your name is John, it goes, welcome, John. And it says welcome, John, in 5 different places because there's all kinds of places you could go in the app. How does it know to do that? Well, the parent component knows your name is John, and it can tell the children how to change. And that's part of the beauty of how these components work. The components go from really big to really small. Again, homepage, probably a really big component. Probably has a bunch of stuff in it, right? It has everything else. Whereas your search bar or like a little employee list element, you know, an LI that would be in a UL, that might have like a picture in it, a name, a title. You can imagine that as one component that you would put into this list. It's small. It doesn't have a lot in it. It doesn't do a whole lot, but it's nice and reusable because you may have 20, 30, 50, 100 employees, and you don't want to write the HTML or even write JavaScript to write the HTML for every single one of those. If you can just plug in some cool component, which magically works, then great. Why wouldn't you do that? So again, power of components, which you just talked about, they're very composable. It makes it very easy to build these complicated apps without doing a whole lot of work. You can reuse your work. All right, so the jQuery style of doing things. So in jQuery, you have this weird kind of jumbled mess where you have event handlers like the click handler and the onload handler and the change handler and all kinds of crazy stuff. And it just changes something that it knows to change when the data changes, right? So you might associate a jQuery function with a specific input or a specific button. And when you click that button or you change that input, something's going to change, but it's all very, very specific, right? And there's no like grand way to coordinate how this stuff works. It's very manual. There's a lot going on. And it gets messy. I mean, that jQuery style with all the arrows isn't untrue. It's very true. It gets messy. You have a lot of code. It's kind of a pain to maintain. And as your app gets big, it's really bad. A lot of you might not have done it yet. Maybe some of you have. But when you're in a really big app that has a lot of jQuery, you kind of want to quit your job because it is a nightmare. And trying to remember where everything goes. And there's no modules. And you're just like, what is all this stuff? And you rewrite code a lot. And it's just nasty. In contrast, when we have React, we're not actually telling it what to change per se. It kind of does that itself. We build these sweet components. They react to changes in data, and they kind of do whatever they're supposed to do just through the magic of React. And I know that sounds kind of like black box magic, and it is a little bit, but you'll see it's pretty intuitive once you get used to it. So the point of this is, when you're listening to changes in data, how do you change? Ooh, that was cool. JavaScript's fast, but whenever we update the DOM, there's a whole lot of things that have to happen. Your layout has to change. You have to look at the CSS stuff again, decide what colors you're going to use and whatever, and then you have to repaint the entire web page. The term paint effectively means your browser needs to take the information from the HTML and the CSS and the JavaScript, and it needs to learn where to put all the individual pixels to make it look how you'd expect it to look. And that's an expensive process. It is in every application. It's no different in the web. So with React, they have this sweet thing called the virtual DOM, which sounds pretty cool, you know? It's like a game almost. And basically what happens is you use raw JavaScript. It may not look like it when we get to React, but you're actually using plain old raw JavaScript. And from the top, it gets all the data it needs. This virtual DOM decides what needs to change. So it'll build your entire HTML page all in one go, dump it on the HTML's real DOM, and then you just have one paint process. Whoop, it's nice and quick, as opposed to jQuery changing all kinds of stuff all over all the time. So it ends up being a lot more effective, right? You can imagine if you knew ahead of time when you're writing jQuery, everything that was going to change at any instance, at any time, for any reason in the app, and you could just compile all that into one event handler, right? It'd be great, right? It'd be fast, it'd be effective. You can't really, I mean, you could, it'd be really hard. React, though, just does that. So it's kind of magic. The virtual DOM, this meme right here of the lady who has no idea what's happening. Yeah, that's kind of right. It's pretty confusing. More about the virtual DOM, pros and cons of React. Say what you want to say. There's not very many. Just going to skip that. The cons of React are probably the difficulty of learning it and the fact that, I don't know, right now the market's so hot, it's hard to say. I would say that the cons are you can lose control of it if you get too fine-grained with your components, or if your components get a little bit too coarse-grained, or if you just don't know what you're doing and you just start putting things in weird places. There's ways that you can mess it up. It sounds magic, it sounds beautiful, and it really is, but there are ways you can mess it up, and you can force things to render too much. You can force things to render forever, in which case you're not going to see anything. So there's lots of ways you can ruin it if you're not careful, because it is complex. As beautiful as it sounds, it's because it's complicated. And that's not to scare you. It's just the nature of the beast. But there's benefits once you understand it. All right, so React sounds pretty magical. What do we need to get started? Babel, which we just talked about briefly. And there's another thing called Webpack. Webpack is called a module bundler. It's Webpack and Babel together make what's called your build system. So in a traditional application, say one written in C++, we have the step of compilation, which we talked about earlier, where it takes all your code, turns it into machine code. And then you might have other stuff. Static checking, checks your code to make sure it's good. It has to compile it. Maybe you have a language that has to compile it to some sort of bytecode and then to machine code. Whatever, it's part of the build system. Your build system in JavaScript's a little different, especially for the web. You have Babel that does your transpilation. So we're going to go ahead and take our React code and all the cool, fun code we write and turn it into plain old code that the browser can understand without any special plugins, even IE 11 if you so dare. And then we use something like Webpack, the module bundler. And module bundler sounds kind of ambiguous and weird, but really all it does, it takes all your code and puts it into one file. That's it. That's literally all it does. And a lot of times it's called bundle.js. So if you ever go to a website that's a bundle.js, they're using some sort of bundler. I can pretty much guarantee it's probably Webpack at this point, especially if it's a single page application. Now, would anyone have a guess as to why we would want to bundle all of our code into one file? It's easier to load. Yeah, that's exactly right. It's easier to load. Think about it. We have one file, okay? We have to go get the one file and you send it back. Or you have 50 files that may add up to be the same size as the one file. You have to make 50 calls. Now, one of the tried and true and will always be true things about programming, it's always more expensive to go to somewhere else and get something than it is to do it where you are. And by that logic, it's going to be more expensive to go somewhere 50 times and get the same amount of data than if you did one time and got the same amount of data. And the reason why is those network calls are really slow. You can make them so fast. For instance, if you had an internet network call that went from New York to London, it would take 23 milliseconds because the speed of light can only go so fast, right? So you automatically have 23 milliseconds of overhead. That might be California to London. I can't remember, but it's one of those. That's as fast as you can get, right? So if you're going 50 times, you have 50 times 23 milliseconds, right? And that's your minimum right there. It's what, a second? Or close to a second, yeah. At least, even if the data is the same. So that's not even calculating your bandwidth or anything else. So module bundling makes a lot of sense when you think about it that way, right? I mean, it's hard to say it doesn't. There's other things Webpack does too. It allows minification. So on that same note, you have your JavaScript bundled in one file. Maybe it's 2 megabytes. It's pretty big. It doesn't sound like it is to us because a lot of the files we use, 5 megabytes, 10 gigabytes, I don't know, whatever crazy files you have on your machine. So 2 megabytes sounds small. But if you're in backwater China trying to get to your website and you have 15 kilobytes per second download speeds, that's pretty big, right? So, and that happens, oddly enough. So if you can use the process of minification, which takes all the empty space out, so you can imagine every space that isn't necessary in your code, and the only spaces that are necessary are the ones in strings. If you take all that space out, those characters are gone, right? That's like 50% practically of a trim in your code length almost all the time. Not always, because you have new lines and stuff, but if you have spaces, then yeah, it cuts a lot out. And then if you can make the function names shorter, because every character is going to cost a little bit of data, right? So every character you type in may be 2 bytes, and if you have 50 characters, you got 100 bytes. If you could somehow take those 50 characters, turn them into 1 byte, like an A or something, well, you've immediately saved yourself 98 bytes. So minification does 2 things. It'll take out spaces and like unnecessary characters, and will also sometimes obfuscate your code and turn it into really ugly looking stuff that is just smaller. And Webpack helps facilitate all of that with your React apps over Babel. So let's see, that's all you need to know about those guys. Can I just use a CDN for all of this? Yeah, you can, but it's going to be a lot slower. Does anyone know what a CDN is? It is a content delivery network. So a lot of applications, you'll go ahead and you can inspect the source of the web page. Let me see if I can do that on GitHub. Let's see if GitHub uses a CDN. Yeah, look at that. So there's these things called content delivery networks, and you can see it right here, assets-CDN. Kind of hard to see. Oh, sweet, look at that. So assets.cdn right here, content delivery network. Basically, you could take all of this JavaScript you're writing with your React app, and you could put it somewhere else on the internet, and you could put inside of your HTML link pages or style script pages and tell it just to go to that address and download everything from there, as opposed to you building it and serving it from your server. What say you? You'd have to get React, you'd have to get React DOM, you'd have to get some other stuff, and then you'd have to get your code, potentially. But it's going to be slower, most likely. And the reason for that is you can't control the CDN at all. You can't control the CDN. You don't know where it's going to be. There's a whole lot of things. It may be more inefficient. Who knows? There's like a billion reasons why it may not be effective. Typically, when you're building your own application and you're shipping out JavaScript, just ship it with your application. Ship it with your HTML at the same time. It's going to make more sense from your own servers. Now, you're probably going to ask me then, why does GitHub use a CDN? And that's a complicated answer. And the answer is kind of rooted in the sense that, well, if you have a really big application, a really big website like GitHub, you probably have users all over the world, and you can't really control a lot of things. So if you have a CDN in every major zone of the world, well, you can have the web page, find the closest zone, and it's going to be faster in that regard. A little bit of a different problem than you're probably going to have at first. But CDNs are useful. Don't think they're not. But in your case, they're not really going to be. So digging into the docs. Does anyone have questions over what we just talked about? It was a mouthful. There's a lot in React. I was going to try to skim through this a little bit more, but React's kind of a complex topic, so I figured I would spend a little bit of time at least talking about it to get you kind of used to it. So any questions on anything I just talked about? Nope. Cool. So what we're going to do is we're going to spend a few minutes going over the documentation for React. You've already installed Yarn and Create React App. If you haven't, go ahead and do that now. And the other thing we're going to do is, so my voice cracks a lot. It's a funny thing. I have a weak voice, and my wife constantly nags me because I'll be yelling at our dogs, and my voice will just go off into some weird pitch, and my dogs, they don't listen to me because of it. I'm well aware I have a weird voice, and I deal with it. So anyway, the TAs are going to go ahead and slack out some questions that I'd like you to work in groups, read through the React documentation, try to answer them together. Reading through the React docs with no React information is a bit overwhelming, and we know that, and that's okay. But it gets you a little bit used to kind of digging through real documentation for a real process and starting to figure it out a little bit on your own. But we're going to help you in a little bit. So we just want you to kind of experiment there. Get in groups, 4 or 5, it doesn't matter. Just do it in your tables. Talk to each other about it. Try to answer some of these questions, and we'll talk in a little bit. And if you're streaming, go ahead and talk on Slack, I guess.
Yeah,
Anybody else not have to listen to calls? Everyone else is here, right? Yeah.
So this one is... The time class over 9:30. 14 minutes. 30 minutes.
So basically, instead of people and
I think I can hit all of the high critical items today, but I might use like one probably won't finish them off, but then I'm tempted to. So we'll go for that, and then no, I'm giving the talk. Some Thursday and the next day as well. Never rough day. And just Trent versus the world.
oh man. Oh yeah. Well, I'm gonna be more. I know, like, the way I can get there. I already feel it. Oh, I mean, one thing. It's great. It's great. Everything was anyway. Yeah, I think the fun part of studying. Yeah.
Sorry to hear that.
I'm not. I'm not sorry.
How old are you?
Year and a half. Yeah. It's kind of like.
Well, now you got a sort of huge job on making
Yeah,
the big
I
bucks.
do.
So
I do.
you're gonna live the high, I guess. A sweet apartment. My wife always tells me, she's like, yeah. She's like, you gotta read all my plans. She's like, we're gonna buy a really nice condo somewhere with a nice view and get a couple of big dogs and be single forever. I was like, party.
That's kind of the life.
Oh yeah? Where?
Don't have to be drunk. We're on 13 bucks.
Okay. Well, it's doing okay.
I mean, it was my choice. So that's yeah.
You have something for a while?
So basically, we build applications for, mainly utility companies. The piece that I work on, called Swift, is, basically, utility company can go in and set up all of these things so that they have a map where the users can go and see where the averages, forms coming, stuff like that, the Catholic alerts and things like that, that go out and so we actually just got this application. We just got our first live today. I can find but yeah, I like it a lot. I get to build a lot of components.
You just run into
For now. The thing I really like about this company is they like integrate in both sides. So like, whatever you want. But yeah, I like it a lot.
That's the phase is first job burnout. So like after like a year and a half, you've been killing it and you're doing good, and then you're like, this is boring. Stop giving you. So hopefully the company doesn't do that for you. Hopefully they give you a little bit more opportunity to expand. But
Now I'm already, I'm starting over Angular now. We have some other stuff. Yeah. We have some like, and it's Angular 1. Yeah. So at least it's like something new, even though it's kind of a pain. I mean, it's like a complicated mess, but I kind of like that because it's like solving a puzzle.
yeah, teaches you a lot of debugging and stuff.
Yeah. So
Yeah, it's a good skill.
that's like, I'm just going to spend like, I'm helping maintain some of the legacy stuff. So excited, yeah.
Well, since it's your first gig, my only recommendation would be the moment you start to feel really bored, find a new job.
Yeah.
It's your first one, you've got a lot to learn. If you've been there for like 18 months at that point, you're good, you're solid. One of the things that makes people a little bit better long term is switching every few years, in the beginning especially. You get more experience, the more diversity of thought you encounter, this is going to make you better. One of the things that I struggle with is some of the people I work with now, they've always been at that company, and that doesn't mean they're bad devs per se, but they have a very narrow view of how the dev world is.
Yeah.
And I mean, it's how those people are, right? They've been at the same company for so long, they're just going to be that way. So I recommend that you, while it's good to stay, obviously, it's good you don't want to just jump ship. But once you hit like 2-3 years, it's probably going to be
That was my plan.
time to
Like,
start
stick
thinking.
it out for about 2 years and then see where I'm at.
Yeah. I think I was at my first one for 2.5 before I finally was like, I'm done. So, All right, cool. Let's go ahead and go over some of the questions that we attempted to answer. So I'm going to just pick random people, and I don't know any of your names. So you're going to have to help me here. I'm just going to say random descriptors, like dude with green hat. It looks like an LM. Yeah, that's your name now, because I don't know. What's your name? Hannibal?
Yeah.
Nice. Hannibal? Okay, so I'm going to ask you the first question. Create React app. What is Create React app? It is an NPM module, yeah.
I'm just reading on the Yarn.
Reading on Yarn? Okay, what's Yarn?
The Yarn, just after you install it, you can reinstall it while you're offline.
Okay, so it adds some offline capabilities, yeah. What is it replacement of? Did you get that far? Yeah, you have an answer? It replaces NPM? Yeah. So it's like not a competitor with NPM per se, but it helps facilitate those NPM packages in a different way. Yarn has a different way of getting the packages. It offers some offline stuff. It's just another way to go about getting your packages. And the React ecosystem uses Yarn because I'm pretty sure Facebook wrote Yarn too. So why not? Anyone create React app? Anyone got a little info on that? Just a quick summary. A starter kit for what? for building a React app. It is a starter kit for building a React app. That's exactly what it is. It helps you create a React app. Who would have thought? What are some of the benefits of React.js? Does anyone want to give a potential answer? Saves time? How so?
I mentioned earlier, yeah.
So it saves time because you can load all the HTML at one time. Yeah, that's true. It does save time with the virtual DOM. Components, you know, they're smaller, more composable. Saves time later down the line. You had your hand up,
I
Purple.
was gonna say the different people.
The different reusable components. Yeah, that's a big one. In here, they say fast learning curve. I don't know if that's true. Depends. And then another one with React, you can learn once and write anywhere. I guess that's true. If anywhere is another React app. But you also are using HTML in your React components, so there's that. What is a React component? Yep. A reusable element? Yes. A React component is a reusable element. It's a nice UI piece, UI independent piece. They're very reusable. They're very small. They compose your JavaScript, your HTML, your CSS, all the kit and caboodle in one little reusable place. That's what a React component is. Did anyone get to React DOM.render? Does anyone know what React DOM.render does? Yeah?
It can get escape, it lets you use non-React.
React DOM.render, yeah. React DOM.render is like the entry point, escape point for React, where you tie it into the real world of HTML, and you tell React to go ahead and do what it needs to do. After that point, React is in charge, and you no longer have to care. And that's going to be the entry point to every React app. You'll have an index.jsx or something like that that has a React DOM.render where you plug in something. Did anyone get to JSX? What's JSX? It's like the new JSXO.
Is it that you're writing your components
Yeah, it is. JSX is the thing getting transpiled. So it's like the new JS in a lot of ways because it allows you to, the X stands for XML. Does anyone know what XML is? It's an old markup language that lots of people used to use. Extensible markup language or something. It's got like a bunch of weird brackets. It looks very similar to HTML actually. It has closing tags and opening tags. And JSX allows you to write XML that is effectively HTML inside of your JavaScript files that then is transpiled into raw JavaScript, which is then turned into HTML on the virtual DOM, which is then put on the real DOM. So JSX is the cool syntax that Facebook recommends you use because it makes writing React a whole lot easier and it makes more sense. What does Facebook recommend is the best way to start building a new React single-page application? I'll give you a hint. We've already talked about it. Create React app, yes. Why? I don't know. I've actually never used it for a real application, funny enough. What is Babel? Who wants to tell us a little bit about Babel and what its relationship with JSX is? We kind of already heard this answer, but let's go a little bit more in depth. Anyone? No? This is a transpiler. So Babel's a transpiler, which takes the JSX, turns it into JavaScript, which then turns it into virtual DOM elements, which then puts on the regular DOM.
JSX its own language then, or is it just its own syntax that gets transpiled and transpiled again?
It's hard to say what the distinction between its own syntax and language is. It's kind of its own language because it allows special things that JavaScript doesn't. However, it's more of a weird extension like syntax to JavaScript. So yes, it's its own language because it's a hybrid of XML and JavaScript. But the Babel kind of takes that whole aspect away and just makes it an extension to JavaScript, really. Yep. If you ever look at the output of React, like the raw output you get from Babel, it's actually just random JavaScript objects. It's really ugly, but you could do it by hand if you wanted to. I've actually had to do stuff like that in a real project before, and it's very useful, the utility of being able to just take an object that kind of looks like a React component and plug it into this thing, and then it just magically makes HTML. Now, JSX is way more convenient because you can write out your HTML like you normally would on an HTML page, but you don't have to do it if you don't want it. If you're a masochist, I guess. What is the significance of the curly braces in JSX? So we're all familiar with the curly braces in JavaScript. They denote an object, right? How are they different in JSX? Anyone get that far? Nope. When you have a JSX component and you're actually going to render the HTML in the XML segment of the JSX, right? So the divs or whatever. If you use the curly braces, that's like your literals, okay? So say you have a string. String says, my name is Carson. And you want to use that string in a React component. You can't just put you can't just put the string variable. So say it's var name equals Carson. You can't just put name anywhere willy-nilly in the React component. You have to use the curly braces to denote that it's like a literal being plugged in there, and it's going to take that value of that variable and turn it into actual HTML. What is a prop? We get to props. So the cool thing about React components is they take something called props. Every single one of them take these props, and they are properties of the React component that are passed in from the parent. That's it. It doesn't sound that complicated, but they're actually incredibly useful, and they really define how React works. Any more questions on React a little bit before we go into a little demo? Nope. Cool. We're going to see really quickly how the Create React app works. So I installed it. I know my terminal is really small. I don't think I found a way to expand this. Oh my God, I just did. Look at that. That's awesome. So, Create React app. We've all installed it globally, okay? So we all got this. Feel free to follow along if you'd like, but you do not have to. First thing you do, type Create React app once it's installed, and then you give it a name. What's your app name going to be? My app. Enter. And you get a whole bunch of crap on your screen. And you're like, okay, that's great. What does that mean? Well, creating a new React app in whatever your parent directory was, plus the name of your app. So the first thing it's going to do is create a new folder. My app, my-app. And in there, it's going to do a whole bunch of stuff. You'll notice this yarn add stuff that's going on. This looks very similar, right, to the npm install. That's because yarn is a package manager and does effectively the same thing. It has this cool little progress bar that it uses that's a little bit better than npm's. And then when it's all done, it tells you, hey, I created a whole bunch of stuff. Like, this is all the stuff I just installed. Well, that's a bunch of stuff. It does a lot of things. I don't know all the stuff it does. Created it in that directory. You can go ahead and you can run these commands from the Create React app. Start, build, test, eject. We suggest you cd into my app and hit yarn start. So why don't we do that? For the magic of React and package builders that do everything for you, we have a fully functioning website. This is what comes out. At localhost port 3000, we have our first React website. Congratulations, you've all written React. Now, it may not seem like much, but it's a really great starting point for any new React app. And let's go ahead and look at the actual code. I'm going to go ahead and shut this down. You'll see this is the output, so you can easily see how you want to get to it, where it is on your network, all the fun stuff you want to do. Tells you a little bit. If it's not optimized, go ahead and do yarn build. Let's go ahead and look at this code, because that's really what we want to see. Why is React so special? I don't know. So, first thing, the root directory. Pretty much everything comes with a README. This is just information about Create React app, what you can do with it. Feel free to read through it if you want. It has some resources, and that's cool. The familiar package JSON, you'll know this, not much different than it is anywhere else, but it has some scripts pre-built for you. The start, which is the one I ran to get that server to come up. Build, which just builds it in a very optimized production-ready way. So this is the code you would ship out to be actually live on the internet. and that's minified, it's uglified, all the stuff we were talking about earlier with Webpack. It does all that fun stuff. Test is to test the code. Eject, I've never actually used eject. I think it basically pumps everything out so you can quickly use it, like if you needed to. I don't know. I've never used it. I think you can just get everything out. But anyway, there's some scripts it gives you. There's this yarn lock file. You may be familiar in NPM. There's an NPM lock or a package JSON lock, package lock JSON. I'm sorry. Same thing. Yarn has its own version of that lock file. You don't need both. You're either going to commit to yarn or NPM. So if you've got a yarn lock and a package lock, you probably want to pick one and decide if you're using NPM or yarn. Yarn actually started the lock file thing, and then NPM was like, oh, that's a good idea, and they added it a little bit later. It's still not as good. People still prefer yarn. I do. It's a little faster. It does better with the locking. We have our git ignore. That just ignores the general stuff, our build stuff, our node modules. Again, we don't want our node module saved in any repos on GitHub or anything, so we want to ignore it, all that stuff. Public. So public is where we're going to keep all of our public resources, I guess. So if you have a favicon icon that you want to, the icon that you want to show up on the browser, you know, like in Gmail, it's a little mail symbol or whatever, up in the tabs, you'd put it here. Any other image resources, your index HTML. So create React app gives you kind of a more complex HTML page, but you don't need all of this necessarily. But basically, the important thing is this is our app. In terms of real HTML that you're going to write, that's technically all you need. A body with an ID on the div tag. Call it whatever you want. Call it root, call it my app. It doesn't really matter. That's all you need. This no script tag is basically if you don't have JavaScript enabled, well, the app's not really going to work, is it? So it's kind of a downside of React is in all of these single page applications, if for some reason someone's living in the dark ages and they decide they're not going to use JavaScript because they want to be super secure, like 60% of the apps on the web aren't going to work for them anyway, but you can put this nice message and tell them that they should enable JavaScript or they're not going to be able to use the modern web. And then there's other stuff in here, not important. Just note that right here, this div ID root, this is the entry point. This is all the HTML you really got to write. This is the important stuff. And it's pretty cool, huh? HTML is kind of irritating to write sometimes. Manifest JSON, it's just some stuff related to create React app. You don't got to worry about that too much unless you get into managing resources and stuff. So the important folder is this source folder. And for now, this is where everything is going to live. And in almost every application you ever write, your source folder is where everything's going to live. And aside from the public stuff, it's a perfect way to do it. And all of our components are just chilling in here too. But there's more than that. So one thing you'll probably notice is there's no JSX in here. There's just JS files. And interesting thing about React is you can actually give the JS or JSX file suffix whatever one you want, really. It doesn't matter. You could make it anything, honestly, as long as your builder knows what files to use. But JS, JSX, there's not really a preference on which one you should use. Sometimes people feel like your JSX file should be .jsx instead of JS, so you know it's a component. But if you structure your application well, it's not really that big of a deal. But it's one thing to note that there's no JSX files in here per se. And you'll see some CSS in here, and that's pretty cool. That's already different, right? So one thing you may remember about traditional CSS is it's usually in like your public folder, public CSS, and then your style, public styles or whatever. Same with your JavaScript. It's not anymore. It's something totally different. And that's because React is magic and can take your CSS and literally put it in the JavaScript and you just have one file. I don't know how it works, but it's awesome. So we talked a little bit about the entry point to the application and a little bit about JSX. And this is your very first JSX file in the wild that we've seen, unless you looked at some before this. But it's the first one I'm showing you. And so we talked a little bit about React DOM render and how it's the entry point to your React app. Does this little segment right here look familiar to anyone? Probably. Because that's good old vanilla JavaScript to go ahead and just get an element, which is that one element I showed you, root, And it's basically saying, hey, react-dom.render. I've got this JSX app. This is all of my JSX right here in this one place, wrapped up in this app. Here it is. I need you to inject it inside of that root component. That root is our wrapper. It is the entire world of React after this. And that's where we're going to inject it. So yeah, you can put other HTML elements in that HTML page if you want and inject everything into root. And everything else will just render weird outside of the React. So when you can play with it, it just look ugly. This registered service worker is a fairly new thing to React Create App. It does something with the network when you have a slow network. I don't really know. I've never actually used it. I just know that it's there. So delete it, keep it, doesn't really matter. They say you should keep it. I don't know. You also notice a couple of things. Index.css, it's imported, but it's nothing. It's just like, give me the string or something. And this is what's called a side effect import. You're importing something directly for its side effects. And in this case, we just want that CSS file to be included in our React so everything else can use it. That's it. That's all we want. That's how you put CSS in your React. It's pure magic. And then the rest are the standard imports that we've seen. We import React. That's a module. Okay, so that'd be like const react equals require React or whatever. And React DOM, another module. Actually, if we look at our package JSON, that is not packaged. We look at our, oh my gosh, package JSON, you'll see React, React DOM, and React scripts are all installed as dependencies. And React and React DOM, absolutely required for React to ever work. Those are the only two things you actually need to get React to work, these two packages. Now, you may ask, why is React DOM a different package than React if it's literally what you need to use React? And I don't know. There's probably documentation on why they did that. Don't ask me. And then app we're importing, which is also weird because we're importing it and calling it app here. And then magically it looks like an HTML element here. That's peculiar. And that's because it's JSX. It's not a normal object. And you have the ability in the index.js, because it's also a JSX file, to write your JSX components like that, like HTML elements. You're probably already thinking the strong corollary between React and HTML means it's probably going to be very HTML-like, and that whole XML thing I was telling you about, effectively HTML. This isn't HTML, though, because there's no HTML element called app. It's XML that looks a lot like HTML. So that's the X in your JSX. But it's weird because you can import it as like a regular object. However, you call it as like an HTML element. Real weird, but you get used to it and you really learn to like it. So I guess we can go ahead and look at the magic app.js. And this is a very basic React component. This is like the bare bones, pretty much how you make a super simple React component. We still import React. You always have to import React, make it a JSX file. Have to. Just like we're importing app.js specifically for side effects, we're actually using it. It's just like there. Same with React. We don't actually use the word React dot anything here. You could, but you'll notice we don't have to. The other thing we use component is imported by itself. However, we still have it imported here. And that's because there's a side effect that your JSX files get from just importing React. And without it, Babbel's like, I don't know what that file is. So you need it. And then we're also importing a logo. This is an SVG, which is also pretty interesting. Literally, this is an SVG. It's like raw HTML SVG. We're just like importing it in and we just use it. Okay, cool. So let's talk a little bit about this component. Everyone remember classes? Talked about that a little bit, right? They have constructors. They do a lot of cool things. You'll notice that React components at their most base form are just classes. And this render function is just like a function that would be on the class. So app.render, perfectly valid thing to call. Now, if you're not the React framework and you call it, I honestly have no idea what's going to happen, probably bust everything up. But you could, if you wanted to, over here in index.js, we could totally call app.render and it'd do something. It would return this right here. So if you wanted to, go nuts. but it extends the component is the other important thing. It's not a React component unless it extends the component. Does anyone not know or not familiar with the extends keyword? That's a weird one, and I don't know if you guys went over that at all. No, not familiar? That's a new one. So extends basically means this React component is another class that does something. And app is going to basically take all of the stuff it does, and then you can do more on top of it. So why it's important is because the component here doesn't actually have a render function, but somewhere deep down in the depths, it potentially uses the render function that it's expecting of its child to do something. Or maybe you have access to other stuff on this app class that the component that you're extending gives you. For instance, there's all kinds of functions that we'll get into that you can just call by default, and they just magically work because the component knows how to use them. So extends basically says, I have this parent, this something, this ether, right? It's a class. It's another class. I'm going to take my app. I'm going to put it on top. I'm going to take all the same stuff, and then I'm going to add more functions to it. I'm extending it. Effectively what it means. If you're more curious in exactly what it is, it's a form of inheritance, is the technical term. If you want to search into it, JavaScript has a weird inheritance model called the prototype model, which you probably played with a little bit. It's just real funky. But this is a form of that direct inheritance of the component class. More computer sciencey. Yeah, question?
So on the logo, SVG, there's no export. So
That's a good question. So on the logo SVG, there's no export. You're right, because it's just an SVG. It's not an imported, exported JS file or anything. It's just a literal SVG. You can imagine if I had a logo.png, right, a ping file, it'd be an image, right? SVGs just so happen to be, they look like HTML markup, and it can be used that way. So it's confusing in that regard. But it's a literal resource that you can import in, which makes it different. So that's a great question, because that is weird. So let's get back to this component. On the topic of that logo, we talked a little bit about the curly braces. You'll notice here they're used, and logo is like passed in almost like it's a function. Because this React component, this image tag here, knows it can take that logo, it's a variable at this point in JavaScript, it can actually take the resource out and put it directly into the image tag, right in that source. So it just like magically renders it all up, and this is the beauty of the virtual DOM. It looks like I'm making a literal image tag. It looks just like it. I mean, you got me. It's not, though. It's an actual JavaScript object that Babel will produce that takes that logo and says, hey, when you make a real image tag on the real DOM, you need to use this logo in the source. So it's intuitive React in the sense that it's like you're writing HTML, but you're really not. And it lets you do other things that HTML doesn't do. Handlebars, right? Handlebars, you're writing real HTML with some weird syntax, some curly braces. They're all weird. They're kind of like these. You have double curly braces as like your template function. That's technically real HTML you're writing, and then the handlebars engine takes that and it says, oh, every time I find these double curly braces, rip it out and put whatever values in there. It's not like taking the actual JavaScript variables and doing something. It's taking the literal string value and putting it into that HTML and then sending it up. But this is taking the actual variables, and it's still in JavaScript. We're still in JavaScript at this point. We've not touched HTML, and we actually never will. React DOM render does, which is weird. You'll notice a couple things are different too, and it kind of gives away that it's not real HTML. Class. In HTML, I would just use class, right? Well, class just so happens to be a keyword in JavaScript. Suddenly, you can no longer use class. Doesn't make sense anymore because we're in JavaScript. We're not in HTML. So, class name. Another weird one like that is labels. You have for, right? FOR. You'd use that to denote what input element it is. It's actually HTML for in React because for some reason, well, you know, for is a keyword because you have the for loops. And you run into those kinds of problems because we're in JavaScript. So again, these class names, I'm just plugging them in like you would normal classes. And when you look at the rendered HTML, it'll be a class. And then right here, this is like a literal text that you'd have in your HTML. It just knows what to do with it. It's pretty magic there. Same here. Just like you would write HTML, you just write the text. You have a code block inside a p tag, all fun. And then we export default the app, which again, here, you import as regular object, and then you turn it into weird old React. So again, let's go ahead and spin that up. Actually, cool, it's still open. If we go ahead and pop open the dev tools, which are going to be insanely hard to see because I'm very confident that they do not zoom, which is terrible. You'll see where this div ID root, and I'm sorry for the people who are sitting on the farther away. It's going to be really hard to see this, but at least want to talk about it. Right here that I have highlighted, that's my div with the ID root that we saw in the HTML file that I said is the only HTML you write. There it is. And then right below that, we have div class app. Now, funny thing, we have the root, and then right inside of that, we have div class app, okay? So if you look at the code that we were just inspecting, look at that again, that's kind of different than what you might expect. We have this app, and the first element there is class name app, so div class app. But what happened to app? Any guesses? What was that? It gets injected into root. Yeah, pretty much. It gets removed effectively, right? It just becomes part of the component. That React component that you're using everywhere else where you're injecting app is just, it's a placeholder for the real HTML that's eventually put into the DOM. So in there, you can see the classes and the image. Here's our image too. That's what it is. It's just that SVG. It tells you exactly where it is. There's an H1. Got all the classes we would expect. Got all the text we would expect. I mean, everything here that we saw, it's just in a weird way because it was a React component, not real HTML. That's a real basic React app. Does anyone have any questions on any of this we just saw? It was a lot. Yeah, what's up? I want to add another component. Where do I do that? That's a fantastic question. The answer is wherever I want, which isn't very helpful, but we're just about to get into that. So the only restriction I have, there's a couple restrictions, but really the only restriction on where I can't use multiple components is effectively right here. You need to have one thing inside of that, that app, or one thing inside the React DOM.render. Doesn't matter how you write that though. I could most definitely do something like const app wrapper. And this is another way you can write React components, not to confuse you, but to also show you and confuse you. I can do div, I can give it a class name, let's call it a red. Oh, nice. I'll actually make this a class. I'll make it easier for you. Class app wrapper and React.component. So here I'm doing it slightly different because I have React.component as opposed to just component because I'm not importing the React, the component itself, right? So the one thing we need for sure is the render function, and then you can simply just return this. Don't worry too much about that. I'll explain it in a moment. and it's closing tag just like you would in HTML. And we'll go ahead and yarn start. Oh no, it didn't take my props. There's a reason why it didn't take my props. It says this props children. Does anyone know? We need the curly braces. Easy to typo. Good news is React tells you right away, because you're like, that is not at all what I wanted. I saved it. React Create App is pretty cool because it automatically reloads in the browser when you change something. So it's hard to see. But if I go into my root, I now have div class red wrapping my app. And the reason why I did that was I can go into my index CSS and I can add .red. I can do background red. Let's see if it auto reloads for me. Sometimes with the CSS it doesn't. Oh, well, there's nothing to show, I guess, because the child is absorbing it, but anyway, that's how you could change it. You can do style. Style is also weird. Because it's like an object now, as opposed to being your typical, see, it gets all weird and huge. Instead of being your typical, just like string, it's now an object, and so everything's kind of different. So this is just an example of where else you could put a React app, a React component, right? I could write another one in this props children. Remember how we talked about props just very briefly, and I said, hey, did you guys hear about props? They're basically properties. Every React component effectively has a prop called children, which is anything you pass directly into it. And in this case, that is the app right here. And it's rendering the app inside of this div. And that's how that div gets there. So this is kind of where else you could put React components. You can put them anywhere, right? We could take any piece of this app and turn it into another component and just inject it whenever we wanted to. We'll get into that in a moment when you make your own little tests. Any more questions on this stuff? Or move on? Pretty crazy. There's a lot you can do with React. It's really, really neat. So what we're going to do, if you guys could slack out the hello div example, we're going to go ahead and we're going to write a little React command that displays your name and some information and stuff. You're going to have to do the create React app to actually create a little, and create React app. Your name for you, and you're all well and good. So we're going to spend about 10 minutes just like playing with that. I'll put the instructions up here. This replace the source folder of your React app with source. Don't worry about that. You're going to create a new React app. And what I want you to do is create your own component. Now we had to skip ahead because we're running out of time. You're going to create a new component, or like I just did, if you would like, and you're going to inject it inside of the app component that's hello div, and it's going to say, hello, my name is, and then you'll put your name. Okay? So seems very simple. This is your first time experiencing React, and you got to use create React app and a whole bunch of tools, but go ahead and give it a shot. You'll get this little file. It'll give you the hello div file, I guess. So you'll just replace the source in your create React app with the source that comes in the the zipped up folder. Sorry, I was reading that wrong. So you will get like example source that you're gonna have to plug in and then make a few changes to. So just in case, you'll have an unsolved, you'll have a folder like this source. You're going to create a React app and you're going to dump this in place of the source that you have generated for you. And this hello div is the one we're changing.
Oh, we are.
We skipped hello. Does it help bootstrapping anything? Get it going and kind of got it started?
Yeah.
Baby steps in the dark. Yeah.
Oh, so.
Does that mean we have to have someone in your guys' table in to give us the answer? No? Maybe? Anything in the middle of it? Your questions on that. So create that step, do that, yeah, and then take the source in there and hope for the best.
Yeah, it's like, I think you just very
Which one is left of once it builds your reaction, we're going to your.
Yeah, it took mine forever. It took me a really long time.
So then you have to, so my app is running
Yeah, so whatever you want to call your React app. But let it do its thing.
Yeah, our group is fairly present.
So essentially inside that. And this
I'm supposed to delete everything in the source file except for the file. I did it once.
All right, I know most people are still working, and that wasn't a whole lot of time, but because there's a couple other exercises we want to get to before we leave today, we're going to go ahead and go over this one. So it was probably pretty tough. Your first time kind of getting into React, and I'm sure a lot of you had errors. A lot of you may not have even gotten to the render phase where you can start up the server, and that's fine. We just kind of want to play with it. Did anyone finish? Did anyone get it to actually render? You did? Nice. That's awesome. Congrats. This is a tough challenge for sure. So let's go ahead and look at the hello div. There's a couple of things that's really weird about the hello div. And I started to kind of show you this and went back a little bit and did the class component instead. But the first thing is it's a function. Okay? And that seems really weird, right? We had this class component and this cool class that had a render function that returned some JSX or whatever, you know, and that was all well and good. But apparently you can just bypass all of that and do just a good old arrow function, right? Why? Does anyone have an idea why? It's because that JSX is just a JavaScript object. So you can return a JavaScript object from a function, can't you? So you can also return JSX. It just looks weird because it's in this weird HTML-esque format. But it's just a JavaScript object at the end of the day, at least according to Babel. There's another weird thing about it too. And that is, if you were to try to render it without this div, did anyone try that? Freaked out. It'll freak out. It'll be like, whoa, you need a parent element, blah, 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 a whole bunch of stuff. But basically, the idea is, in any traditional React component, you can only have one parent element. And in this case, it's a div. And a lot of times, it's just a div or a span or a p tag or something that's some sort of container based off of what the component is supposed to be, right? So in this case, the container is this div. And this is how you had to make every React component for a long, long time, until recently, when they introduced React 16. Gives you a couple of options. The first one is, and this one's really trippy, and I like it a lot, you can use what's called a React fragment. And a React fragment basically says, hey, React, I know I need a parent element. I don't really want one. I don't want an extra div because that's just an extra element for no real reason. Instead, I'm just going to do that. Say, React, just do whatever it is that you do with your magic React powers and give me a parent element, and it'll obey this. It'll be like, that's cool, sure. And it's really weird. You could also, if you wanted to be more literal, pull the fragment component out, use that instead. But frankly, I think the empty component right here is, one, easier to write because I don't got to import anything, and looks really cool, and you feel like you're really smart and stuff. Like, look at how awesome this is, right? It's just like an empty component. No, I feel smart when I use it. So that's one way. You can avoid having an extra div, just in case that ruins your rendering or whatever. The other thing you can do is return one of these. We all know what that is, right? Hooray! Hooray! Yeah, no? I'm glad someone laughed. So, your good old array, note that you're returning a bunch of components, and it takes all of those, and it turns it into a React component somehow. So say you wanted to return just a list of LIs because they need to go into some grand UL that has all kinds of styling and does all kinds of fun stuff, and you just want a file that returns the built LI components, you can do it this way. That's perfectly valid. So those are three ways that you could have written this component to encapsulate all of these different elements. I did not expect you to know really any of them. So the fact that we did have people finish is great. That's fantastic. And this is kind of your first stab at it. So I haven't done this in a while, and I should have been. But fist of 5, how are we feeling about React right now? 4s, some 5s, some 4s, some 3s. It's kind of a gray area. It's awesome, though, that you're all starting to feel a little bit confident in this, because it actually is a really hard subject to wrap your head around, because it's so vastly different from any other JavaScript you're ever really going to do. So that's great. Any questions on this little thing before we move on? Nope. Cool. Well, we're going to skip ahead a little bit. Okay, so the next thing we're going to do is play with our good friend Bootstrap in React. So we all love Bootstrap, right? No? Yes? No? Let me go ahead and just pop open the code. Beyond start. First things first, we have just some ugly stuff, okay? And this is effectively, for all intents and purposes, Bootstrap code that's written without the Bootstrap styles linked in. So we all remember when we use Bootstrap we have what? What do we need to get Bootstrap to work? Just basic. We need the CDN to Bootstrap, or you need the physical Bootstrap CSS files if you really want to. But you need those, and I don't necessarily have those. But what I do have is a bunch of React components. Well, we have one. Hello Bootstrap here. It has all of our familiar Bootstrap class names. Button primary, we have the columns and stuff, and headers and all kinds of crazy stuff that we're used to using with Bootstrap, cards and all the fun things. But again, we need the traditional old Bootstrap CDN. So let's go ahead and get that. Pull that in. It's a long one. It's ugly. It's real ugly. All right, so we added the Bootstrap CDN. We may or may not have to restart. Nope, perfect. So again, through the magic of Create React App, it does what's called hot module replacement. And when I make a change and save the code, it's just smart enough to reload it for me. And it did. It reloaded the HTML page that I changed with the new CDN link, and now we have Bootstrap, just like we normally would. And this is just like any old Bootstrap. So let's go ahead, look at the code one last time. Let's open this bad boy up. Look at the Hello Bootstrap. You can see it's just directly rendered, kind of like our Hello div was. Again, this is just a function, kind of like the Hello div, very similar. We have this container, your Bootstrap container, that everything's in, and it looks like, I mean, this is almost identical to regular HTML. The only real difference is this right there, right? As long as you know that, and you know how to write basic Bootstrap HTML, you can write React. There's some other fun stuff around it, but just ignore that. It's this simple, really. At least that's what they tell you. It's not that simple. So definitely don't feel bad if this seems like a lot, because it most definitely is. It's supposed to seem so trivial and simple that you can just put HTML in. To a point it is, and it will be for you all one day. But for now, it's still weird because you got to understand how the renders work and all of this jazz. But the point being, if I wanted to write Bootstrap, it's almost identical to how I would do it in HTML. You just have the little React fluff that comes with it. So, any questions on this? You're immediately going to do another exercise on Bootstrap. It's number 5, student Hello Bootstrap. They'll slack that out and give you in about another 10 minutes or so. And what we got? I'll put the instructions up here.
What's the solutions that we actually figure out? No.
One of the worst spots, I'll tell you. If you look at the content, it's the last few so you don't have to go and try it.
I had three. So just like right there, one reaction. That's the only thing we do.
You okay with it? Yeah. Open your doc, it's not a bad way.
Yeah, so I have.
I did that. Since you told me the activity, so you don't have to. Yeah. So I.
Yeah, it takes some getting used to, but,
I feel like this is like, as bootstrap was, all those components were structured for the
and then like once you
What
get
they're
used
having
to
to
it.
do is make like a
I just copy. Yeah, if you copy. So if you copy, it's a little bit frustrating, but like if you copy straight from Bootstrap and you put it in there, then you can just find everything that's flat. Yeah, the only other thing that could possibly be different is if it happens to have a full
Oh, yeah.
because, yeah. Yes, and then you can actually go with that.
In this case, I have a bootstrap. The only component is their. So you control H, I don't know, there's maybe a quick way. You control H. And when I have to find all, so I can't take a class. Whatever you throw in there, yeah, you can always get.
Yeah, there is a quick way to just grab all of them like that. So then you can type them all in there. The only thing you have to worry about when you're doing that is if it happens to be pretty, you have a flat with any change that. So then, so then you have that.
There's different ways of doing it. That's
Finding the place.
that's the one where, yeah.
I was like, the one where you the highlight.
I don't know. Anytime you double click and then highlight these words, rather than.
Oh, you still have to take Control F, find all, select all periods, move font up. Yeah. All periods are now 15. Very much
And do that. Why?
Margin required, doesn't require.
It just honestly adds about 15%. That moment where you're like writing an 8-page paper, I mean, we got 7. I'm sure you get that done.
Gonna give you a couple more minutes and then we're gonna go over it as our last thing and go home.
Right?
Oh, okay. Oh, it's nice. It'll tell you that you know.
Yeah.
By the way, oh.
I did a little bit, I'll check on some more. Got some other stuff.
You know, like, heart rate a few times.
We do have a bootstrap, pitch down one, and back to
The only thing that's different is the only other thing but you shouldn't have to do that because the nav is the parent component that was yeah, so the opening have did you do it? Okay, so it's gotta be something that we're talking about. Yeah, but I feel we're not gonna get time.
All right, let's go over this real quick. Whoa. All right, so there were two pathways. Take on this one. You could there was like a first component you can make, and then there was break it up into several components and try to write it that way, which was a lot harder. So first, let's look at the first component. So similar to the example I showed you, similar to the hello div, we're just gonna have our app go directly to our hello bootstrap. Okay. Now there's a couple important things. One, your React components need to start with the capital letter. Pascal case is what it's called. Pascal case means every word has to be capitalized. So hello's a word, bootstrap's a word, capitalize both of them. Pascal case. Camel case, which we typically do in JavaScript, lowercase first letter, the rest of the words are uppercase. Okay. The other thing is, it's typical good React convention when you have what's called a void element, or an element that doesn't have any children, to just self-close it. React can do whatever it wants, right? It doesn't follow the traditional rules of HTML. So you can self-close whatever you want. You self-close a div, I guess. I don't know why you'd have a div with nothing in it, but you could. The other thing is, I led you astray a little bit because I said the fragments would work, and you might need a plugin or something because we had people try it and it didn't work. So don't try that yet. Google how to get the fragments to work. There must be a plugin. I don't know. We used it on my last project. Who knows what plugins I have on there? Couldn't tell you. But anyway, it is a real thing. Trust me. Okay, so the Hello Bootstrap. This one is a little bit more of a complex example of how to add a bunch of Bootstrap in. And we've got a few things. Again, touch on the class name. That's slightly different than HTML. We have more self-closing elements, like those void elements, which you'll see there's some down here somewhere. It's effectively HTML, though. Like, the important thing is it is really HTML with just a few differences. Now, the data elements, the data attributes, they're all the same. ARIA, they're all the same. So you kind of have to, when you're learning about React and what to name your attributes, you have to do some exploring because it's not always so obvious. You would think they would all be exactly the same, but they're not. Why would they make it that easy for you? I don't know. So when you're going and you're making components, you'll probably have to Google a little bit, and that's okay. Sometimes you may forget class names like this, or you may forget style is a weird object, or you may forget that the data attributes are apparently exactly the same as they are in regular JavaScript for some reason. It happens. So again, important thing here is really the only differences from traditional HTML. We got the class name, we have a few other things. Things are named slightly differently, but otherwise it's effectively the same. Your React components, they have to have one parent element that they return. Any questions on this big guy? No? Cool. So right now at this exact point, before we go over to like the bonus, Fist of 5, how we feeling about React after today? Basics of React. You don't got to be an expert. We're getting there. We're making some progress. Okay, that's good. Yeah, this one actually, the funny thing is some of you are probably feeling more confident for this exercise, and that's okay. We're doing a little bit more. We're adding a little bit more in, and it's perfectly fine for this to be hard. So the bonus was split stuff up into separate components. So we also have this card, Jumbotron, and navbar component. You look at the navbar here. It's just the navbar. All right? That's all it is. Jumbotron, just the Jumbotron. Card, you guessed it, it's just the card. And that's awesome. But how do we use these? Where Hello Bootstrap had the navbar up top in a container, and then it has the Jumbotron, right? In between that, and then it has the card. So how are we going to render all of those together as separate components? We import each one as the start, right? So navbar would be first, right? Again, it's self-closing because it doesn't have any children. And then Jumbotron would be next. And then card would be last. The children of the navbar would be if you decided to split out these, like say you wanted navbar title or navbar dropdown or navbar button or whatever. You could do that, and those would be the children. So one quick question about this, is this going to work? Are we missing something? We're missing where we want to put it? Kind of. I mean, it's being rendered in the index.js still. But we're missing something. See, there it goes again, guys. That was me. We're missing something to surround these components. Can we just return 3 components like that? We need a div. Div or a fragment, and since apparently fragments don't work out of the box like I thought they did,
Fragment.
You
The fancy like that.
You couldn't get the okay, so if I did fragment like that, it would work. So we could use a fragment, and that'd be fine. Or you can wrap it all in a div. But for this case, we're going to wrap it in a div because we want to add a class name container. And that's how you get it to work with individual components. So this is more, have any of you heard the term idiomatic before? You'll hear that one a lot in coding. Idiomatic is like by the book, right? How do you do it? How do the people who wrote it do it? Like, how do they expect it to be written? Idiomatic React would have the Pascal case components, right? So depending on your compiler, maybe there are React compilers that let you not, or React transpilers that let you not have Pascal case components. But it's not idiomatic. They expect that best practice React is probably going to have those. But what I'm getting at is these three separate components we have here are a bit more idiomatic than the Hello Bootstrap mega component. And the reason why is in React, the whole goal of React in general is to have things in small composable components, right? As opposed to one giant component. If we were going to do one giant component, well, you're not that far away from just doing regular HTML. And the benefit of the composition of these React components is gone. So one of the major selling points of React is just dead. So this is a bit more idiomatic. Separating things out into small reusable chunks is good. Now the next question you may have is, well, how small do I go? Because you could obviously make every HTML element its own React component, but that also defeats the purpose because you might as well write HTML, right? So it's a balance is really the answer. Depends on what you need and what you're doing, and you kind of got to figure it out yourself, which isn't very helpful, but that's the case. Any questions on this at all? Anything on React? I know we covered a lot today. It was kind of a mess in the beginning, and again, I'm sorry about that. Next Thursday won't be. Well, it might be. We'll see. But anything else? If no questions, then you're good. We'll hang out for the next 20, 30 minutes, answer any questions you got. Otherwise, I'll see you guys in a week. No problem. Streamers, I'm going to turn off the stream.